Couple of announcements. Number one, for those of y'all that just came in the room, please email Dixie back if you're going to be going to the bull sale this Friday. I really encourage you to go. Last year they sold a bull for $235,000, so that was kind of exciting. Also, any outstanding lab reports from any labs up until the one we're doing this Friday, we want those reports due this Friday, because we got to have time to be grading all of those as well as making your exams and tests and all that kind of stuff. So any outstanding lab reports should be done by this Friday, with the exception of the lab report for the trip that we're going on Friday. And then try to get that in. The sooner you get that one in, the better off for our sanity and your sanity and otherwise. I think that's it. I'm going to post a thing in Blackboard whenever I can scan it. It's an article that was in a Farm Bureau magazine a couple months ago about the Knollcrest farms that we're going to Friday. So you can get that and read for the fun of it. But it might be on the website for the farm that Dixie emailed you anyway, but still. Any questions about any of that? Okay, well, I'll shut up and let Leanne drive then.
All right. Well, I hope everybody had a good Thanksgiving. Did everybody eat a lot of turkey?
Oh, yeah.
You know, like 10 pounds like I did. Well, so a quick announcement. There is one last assignment posted on Blackboard. Some of you have already seen it and already turned it in, but it's not due until next Tuesday. So if you haven't seen it, you still have a week. So it's just a kind of quick assignment. I basically just want you to research an issue in animal safety with like animal welfare or the removal of antibiotics, or it can be any species of your choice, any sort of issue that's going on now. Just research that, and then I have a couple of questions that I want you to kind of hit on, and just do like a quick little like one-page summary on that. But I have specific questions listed to kind of guide you through like what I want you to look at. So if anybody has any questions about that, let me know. Email me. If you have trouble finding something, let me know, and I can kind of help guide you and give you some ideas. But so that's already on Blackboard. So we'll do next Tuesday. Does anybody have any questions about anything before we get started today? Okay. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about animal diseases. So kind of it's still in that section where we're talking about welfare and health and things like that. So we're going to talk specifically about diseases today. So just to give you a brief overview of animal diseases, they can be a threat to humans' well-being as well as the animals. So some of you may have heard this term before, but a zoonotic disease is an infectious animal disease that can cross species barriers and cause serious diseases in people. So diseases in animals can be a big deal for the animals, of course, but it's also important to remember that it can be a big deal for humans as well. So diseases reduce the productivity of your livestock production, and that's through animal mortality. So animals that are dying obviously aren't going to be bringing in, and reduced productivity, because when animals are sick, they're using a lot of their energy towards the immune system, and they're not using energy for growth, so they're going to have reduced productivity. Diseases can also kill or incapacitate valuable and or much loved horses and companion animals. So it's not just an issue in livestock, it's an issue for any animal species and people as well. So the impact of animal disease on livestock is pretty significant. So there are mechanisms that can combat animal diseases. So things that you would, kind of think of, common sense, like good management practices, good sanitation, biosecurity, which we're going to go into a little bit more detail later, proper vet care, so realizing when an animal is sick and when you do need to call the vet, monitoring and depopulation in the event of an outbreak. So if there is an outbreak at at a, let's say like a pig farm or a poultry farm that you can't get under control, sometimes people will have to go in and depopulate those barns because they don't want it to spread any farther. So sometimes knowing when to make that call can be important as well. Vaccines, prophylactic drugs, and then therapeutic drugs, of course, are all important. And there's been a tremendous impact of animal diseases in North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, pretty much all over, anywhere where there's livestock production or animals. It can be a problem. So just a few definitions before we kind of jump right into the lecture. So epidemiology is the science of the cause, spread, and control of disease. So that's what that field is called. And then you might have heard diseases referred to as either an epidemic or a pandemic before. So an epidemic disease is an infectious disease that can spread very quickly and cause a lot of animals or people to become sick or at least show clinical symptoms of illness. And then a pandemic is actually an epidemic that affects a large number of people and occurs across the world. So pandemic is pretty much still the same as an epidemic, but once it's reached several sections or parts of the world and a certain number of people, it's considered a pandemic. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, I was talking about zoonotic disease. So zoonosis is when an infectious disease is spread from animals to people, and this can happen directly through a bite or by an aerosol. So like if that animal sneezes or something, or in food through a vector such as mosquito also can happen. So if a mosquito bites an infected animal and then bites you, that could transfer some diseases. So obviously it would depend on the disease, but that can happen. So there are different types of diseases. There are viral diseases and bacterial diseases. So some viral diseases that you probably have at least heard of: rabies, avian influenza, equine encephalitis virus, just to name a few. And then bacterial diseases are the bubonic plague, which you may have heard about like in high school in a history class somewhere, salmonellosis, and anthrax.
Don't squirrels still carry the bubonic plague?
Sorry? Doesn't what?
I asked, don't some squirrels still carry the Black Death?
I feel like I've heard that before, but I'm not positive enough to confirm that. I don't know. I don't want to tell you wrong. It's possible. I feel like I actually heard that somewhere, but I'm not 100% on that. So sorry, I can't answer that for you.
Fine.
But if you find out, if you look it up, let me know next class, because that's kind of interesting. So other diseases that could be spread to people that could be zoonotic or spread to other species are prion-based diseases. So we've already talked a little bit about mad cow. So that can actually be spread to humans. And we'll talk a little bit more about mad cow specifically and how it can be spread to humans in a little bit. But so when it is spread to humans, it is known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So kind of human mad cow disease. Trichinosis is also the larval stage of roundworm. That's another one where it can be transferred to different species. Cryptosporidiosis is a new well, not really new, but it's kind of an emerging highly infectious disease caused by a protozoa. So it's specifically caused by Cryptosporidium parvum. So obviously you can see that the disease name kind of comes from the organism that's causing it. And you'll see that with a lot of disease names. So that can actually be transmitted between people and from the feces of dogs and cats. And then cattle can also be a reservoir for this disease. So that's also another thing to consider is the term kind of reservoir or carrier. Some animals may carry a disease but not actually show clinical symptoms. But just if they're carrying it, they can still be spreading it to other animals. So it's really important to be aware of which diseases in your area you kind of need to look out for, and just kind of be ready to deal with that. Just because an animal's not showing symptoms doesn't always mean that it's not carrying it. So this organism that caused cryptosporidiosis is resistant to inactivation in the environment, and there's no pharmaceutical therapy. So there's not really a whole lot to treat this. So that's kind of again, an emerging highly infectious disease that's kind of become a problem because there's not really a good way to control it with drugs like there are with some other diseases. So prion diseases are a really important category of diseases. So again, prion diseases are what cause mad cow. And so how they kind of work, prions are infectious agents that are made out of protein. So basically what happens is that there's an abnormal folding of these native amyloid proteins, which is a specific type of protein. And so when proteins are being synthesized and being constructed, they go through several steps of like a folding process. And with the prion situation, they're folded abnormally. And so if they're folded abnormally, that's going to affect their function. They're no longer going to really function like a normal protein, so they have an abnormal function. So that often occurs in the nervous system, and that's what causes this progressive degeneration of the brain tissue in animals that have this. So that's why it's kind of called mad cow, which again we'll talk about a little bit more specifically as we go through, because their brain tissue is actually kind of being, it's degenerating, it's basically dying. So this also is called transmissible spongiform encephalitis. So TSE, and typically that's what it's called more in sheep. Again, it's BSE in cattle, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. But you can pretty much just know it as mad cow, but know that BSE is kind of the technical term. So there are a lot of different diseases that kind of fall under the TSE category. So remember, like TSE is covering all of these. So BSE is kind of a form of TSE. So they all kind of fall under this category, and they're caused by prions. So BSE or mad cow disease is in cattle. It's called scrapie in sheep, or sometimes people kind of call it TSE in sheep as well, but scrapie is easier to say. Chronic wasting disease in deer and elk, so that can happen in wild populations as well. They can be exposed to this disease. In humans is another word for it. Transmissible mink encephalopathy. So mink can, again, pretty much almost any animal can be susceptible to this, and humans. And then it's called TSE in cats. And then, like I said, in humans, it's also called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, or CJD. And I think that has something to do with the first person that maybe got it, maybe where that name came from, because there was a person in the UK, I don't remember if it was in the 2000s or the 90s, that actually got mad cow disease, and so it's called this Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. I'm not positive on that, but I think it may have something to do with this. Anyway, and then there's also a variant of that disease in So now we're going to talk about mad cow specifically. I know that we've kind of mentioned it before, but haven't really gone into too much detail. So it is a progressive fatal brain disease of cattle with the neural degeneration like we talked about. So there's not really a way to treat it once a cow has it, and so it is fatal. It was first observed in the United Kingdom in the late 1990s and 2000s. So by 2000, there had been cases in North America. So there were 11 cases in Canada and 2 in the U.S. And so it was thought that it was spread by feeding ruminant meat and bone meal to calves. So when cattle are slaughtered, there's a lot of bone and left over that don't go for human consumption. So bone meal is a mixture of coarsely ground animal bones and other slaughterhouse waste products. And so you can see this picture on the right that just kind of shows you what that looks like. It may vary a little bit in color depending on, exactly what's in there. But it's basically just a lot of things that are left over that are ground up into this meal. But so the meat and bone meal would possibly contain the BSC prions that were in the nervous tissue, so the brain and spinal cord from infected cattle. Because obviously the brain and spinal cord are not going for human consumption, they would be left over and then ground into this meat and bone meal. And those prions can actually survive, and if they're fed to another animal, that animal is more than likely going to develop that disease. So that's kind of where they figured out that this was probably being spread. Symptoms of mad cow disease or BSE include incoordination, so trouble walking or getting up. Cows may kind of just be stumbling around. They may up with their front legs but can't get their back end up. Lots of different symptoms. Infected animal may act very nervous or violent. So that's kind of where the term mad cow comes from, because their brain tissue is dying, so it may change their behavior. And there's no really reliable way to test for it in a live cow. So that kind of makes it hard, because you can look at the brain under the microscope after death and kind of see almost holes where there's areas where the brain tissue has been dying. But other than looking at the symptoms, there's no way to test in a live cow and prove that they have it. So it's something that's done after the fact, unfortunately. But obviously, if you have a cow that's showing symptoms, you kind of know that might be possible. So there's no treatment for it, like I said. So it is a fatal disease. So that's why things are in place to control for it. And it actually has an extremely long incubation period. So it takes 4 to 6 years for an infected cow to actually show symptoms of this. So probably the animals that you would see being affected would be like cows that you kept around in the herd for a long time. Because probably if you're, raising steers to go to slaughter, they're going to be long gone before they get to 4 or 6 years old, probably. So it'd be animals that have been around in your herd for a while. So once a cow shows symptoms, it will continue to get more and more sick until it dies. Like I said, there's no treatment, so it's not going to get any better. And that will usually take about 2 weeks to 6 months. So not a very long time. It can be pretty rapid once they start showing symptoms. So treatment, how is BSE prevented? What do we have in place to try to prevent the spread of this disease? So the government in the U.S. has several approaches to prevent and reduce the occurrence of BSE in the United States. So the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, doesn't allow most parts from cows and certain other animals to be used in feed that will then be fed back to cows. So that helps avoid that situation where you could end up having meat and bone meal that contains infected tissue from a cow being fed to another cow. So that rule kind of helps prevent that. So the USDA makes sure that high-risk cow parts like the brain and spinal cord, so that nervous tissue, and cows showing any symptoms are not used to make food for people or other animals. So it's not, like I said, there's no way to prove it in a live animal. So if an animal is showing any sort of symptom of BSE, that animal is not going to be used for human consumption or fed to other cows because it's not worth the risk. So the USDA actually samples 40,000 animals per year to test for BSE. So that would probably be like at the slaughterhouse. Because again, you can't tell in a live animal. They also stop the imports of live animals or animal products from countries that are known to have BSE. So the U.S. has been BSE free for quite some time, but we do import and export a lot of things. And so if it's known that a country has had an outbreak or still has it or has had a case recently, then we won't be importing products from that country. So lots of things that kind of go into managing the spread of this disease. You might have any questions?
Yes. Sorry. So how do they? So they test what parts, like the cow? Do they test for the BSE?
Yeah. So they would look at the like brain tissue most likely under a microscope, and you can actually see. I should have found a picture, if I could have. And you can see like the dead brain tissue. And so you can see by looking at the brain tissue through a microscope, it's pretty easy to tell whether or not they had mad cow disease. So that would be my first guess of how they would do it, is just getting that brain tissue and looking at roughly 40,000 random samples a year to see if it's popping up anywhere. So because the disease affects the nervous tissue, so that's really where you would see it, is by looking at the brain and the spinal cord tissue. Like you're probably not going to see anything if they sampled like muscle or anything. So they'd be looking at those tissues. Any other questions? Good. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about viruses. So viruses can have either DNA or RNA as their primary genetic material. So remember, they're similar. DNA is just transcribed to RNA and then goes on to make protein. So like humans have DNA as their primary genetic material, but some viruses may have RNA. They may already have RNA as their main kind of starting point for their genetic material. So the Baltimore system assigns viruses to one of 7 groups based on the form of the DNA or the RNA. And so I'm not really going to go through each one of these. This is just more for your information. I'm not going to make you like memorize the 7 types of viruses. But there are just different. So you have like double-stranded DNA or single-stranded. So you know how DNA is double-stranded and it's the double helix. Viruses can have some that's just one strand of DNA. So that's a difference. And then positive sense RNA or negative sense. So positive sense would be RNA that, I think if I get this right, it's positive sense RNA that can be converted back to DNA, but negative sense would have to go through more of a process to be converted back to DNA, I think, if I got that right. But again, I'm not going to really ask you to know specifics on this slide. Just know that there are different types of viruses and that they have different types of DNA or RNA as their genetic material. And so that can really depend on how that can change how they cause infection and how you need to go about treating them. So viral diseases of dogs include distemper, rabies, parvo, foot and mouth disease, which we're going to talk about more on the livestock side, and avian influenza, because again, some of those are zoonotic, so they can be spread to different species. Distemper can be a major cause of death in puppies. So if you've ever had a dog and you've taken it to the vet, you've probably heard them say that they gave it a distemper vaccine. So symptoms would be fever, loss of appetite, vomiting, coughing, and then any sort of like kind of mucus or discharge from the eyes and the nose. And again, vaccination can prevent this. So if you have puppies and they go and get their like 6-month shots or whatever, they should be vaccinated for this. So vaccination is a really, really good thing, and that can help prevent some viral disease. So rabies is another big viral disease that I'm sure most of you have heard of. So it's a viral disease of mammalian species. So like it wouldn't really infect like fish or anything that's not a mammal. So good examples would be bats, dogs, foxes, raccoons, skunks, and people. People can get rabies. And it's spread primarily by animal bites. So rabies can definitely be an issue if you spend a lot of time outside and you have a risk of coming into contact with a wild animal that may have it. So symptoms to be aware of, symptoms include a change in behavior. So I know like you've probably heard about this, but like if you see an animal that's typically nocturnal, like a raccoon, that's out during the daytime, that's a good hint that something's not right. We had a rabid raccoon come in my yard one time, and it would just walk into our yard in the daytime, and raccoons are normally nocturnal, and it was just kind of being really aggressive, just walking right at my dogs. It had no concern for its life. And so we were trying to like get them away. Luckily they were vaccinated, but things like that if you observe an animal and something just doesn't seem right and that's kind of out of character, and all of a sudden a wild animal is kind of like just coming at you and they're not afraid at all, that's a good sign that they may have rabies. Aggressiveness, of course, is another one. Reluctant to eat or drink. Hypersalivation. So if anyone's ever watched the old Yeller movie, I used to watch it a lot as a kid and cried like all the time. There's that scene where the dog's like foaming at the mouth. So that's kind of like a typical sign of rabies once it's kind of progressed. And then paralysis can occur, and then eventually death. So this disease does progress very, very rapidly. So if you do suspect that an animal has it, or if you suspect that your dog has been bitten, even if they're vaccinated, it's good to go ahead and quarantine that animal because you don't want it to progress to the point that animal's aggressive and it's out on the road. So we actually had to quarantine our dogs after that incident with the raccoon because they did get into an altercation with it, and they had been vaccinated, but just to be safe, animal control made us keep them pinned up for I think it was like 30 or 60 days until that time had passed to determine if they were going to show it. So if you think your animal has come into contact with it, go ahead and quarantine that animal just to be safe. So it's almost always fatal in humans, and most animals, like I said, it progresses very rapidly, and there's not really a lot you can do once that happens. So that's why a rabies vaccination is required for dogs and cats in the U.S. So that's required in all states. So if you have a dog or cat, make sure that you have your little rabies tag and certification, and that you keep up with those shots, especially if you have animals that are going to be going outside. Because you want to keep your animals safe, but you also want to keep yourself safe. And if you have a dog that gets it, you're going to be in contact with that dog. So it's really, really good that that's required. And another thing I will say is that if you do get bitten, you can go, and there are vaccines and shots for people if you can go early enough. And like also if you're going to be in contact with animals, some people may require it. So like, because I work with pigs, which they're not really outside in contact with wild animals. But I was actually required to get the three shot series of the rabies vaccination, which is good because now I have it. But so if you're in a field where you are working with animals and you may come into contact with animals, then it might be required for your job. So it's just something also to be aware of. So foot and mouth.
Leanne,
yes.
Were there any side effects to those shots that you had to take?
I didn't have any. I know that there can be, like with any shot. I know that sometimes people can have side effects. Passing out, feeling nauseous, all of that. I think there's probably more severe side effects. But I didn't have any problem with it. It was 3, I think, over the course of a year. So I think I took one like about every 3 months or something like that. So they spread it out to kind of prevent, giving you such a large dose at one time. And then like a year later, you have to get a booster shot.
That's a little different than the inoculation that you'd have to get for you to be known that you had an exposure.
Right. Yeah. So if you've known that you've had an exposure, it's going to be one dose. You'll probably have more pain and probably more likely to have side effects, I would think, from that one.
Okay,
and
thanks.
And it's super expensive. So like I would recommend, like if you are going to be around a lot of animals and you can get it, especially if your job will pay for it, go ahead and get it, because if you do get bitten, it's very, very expensive to go and get that shot. That one shot or however many they do if you are exposed to it. So I would say if you can get it, go ahead and get it and get it over with. You never know when it might come in handy. I had a possum somehow enter my apartment through my washer. And I was like, well, I'll deal with this. I've had my rabies shot. I'll take one for the team. So if you can get it, go ahead and get it.
I'm going to call you next time I get a possum on the back porch.
Yeah, I was like, your friend's neighborhood animal scientist. Like, it just came in. I mean, I live in a crappy apartment, but it came in from behind my washing machine and was just like chilling. And I was like, okay. So I had to like catch it in a fishing net and like all of this stuff. Like, it was ridiculous. I was just walking through the parking lot of my complex with a possum in a net.
Nice.
Yeah.
In the event of an animal that may be rabid, is it correct that it's safe to shoot them in the heart but not shoot them in the head?
I would say so. I mean, if you can shoot them in the heart, like if you're a good enough shot and you can get close enough to it. I don't really know. The only thing I would think is that like if you shoot them in the heart, that's going to be pretty instant. And sometimes if you shoot them in the head, animals can kind of like, depending on where you shoot them, it may not kill them instantly. And so they might become more aggressive or something like that. I don't know. Is there a specific reason you were thinking?
I'd always heard that if you shot them in the head, that there was a chance that the virus would get there because you're shooting nervous tissue. I don't know if that was true or not. That's just what I was wondering.
Yeah. I mean, I would say like it's possible. I mean, because brain matter does kind of like, it could splatter. But I mean, it would really depend on like how close you are. But from that perspective, I mean, yeah, the heart does make more sense if you can get close enough and you have good enough to be able to decide. But I mean, if you're far enough away, I would say just shooting it would probably be best. If you can't really aim one way or the other. Or just staying away from it and calling animal control is also another option if you don't want to deal with it. So yeah, But I'm not really sure, honestly, on that specifically.
But now you know how Flint spends his weekends.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can call him for rabid animals, and you can call me for possums. All right. Any more questions on rabies? Okay. So foot and mouth disease is another disease that can really cause problems in livestock. It's also known as hoof and mouth disease, obviously, because some livestock have hooves instead of feet. So it's a highly contagious viral disease of cattle, pigs, and sheep. So it affects animals that have divided hooves. So it does not affect horses, dogs, or cats. So that's an interesting distinction with this disease that I thought was pretty interesting. So North America has been foot and mouth disease free since 1954. So even though we haven't really had a case since 1954, because this can be such a devastating disease, it's important that we still understand it and we know how to control it, because you never know when something is going to pop back up. Like blackleg is another problem with cattle, and my uncle had an incident with that a couple of years ago, because the organism that causes that can stay in the soil for like hundreds of years. So it's still good to always be aware of diseases, even if they're not necessarily a current problem. So there was a significant outbreak in the UK in 2001, and 7 million animals were culled or, killed, removed from the herd. So obviously that caused a lot of economic losses, because those animals were not able to be sold and remain in production. So vaccines are available, and they're used in countries where this disease is still found. However, one important thing about this disease is that the vaccine must match the subtype. So subtype just means that you have this type of disease, but viruses can kind of change the genetic makeup very rapidly. And so you can have kind of different versions of this virus or different subtypes. And so you can't just do a general vaccine. You have to know which subtype is more likely in that area and match the vaccine accordingly, because each subtype is kind of just a little bit different. So that's something that's important to note with foot and mouth disease. So symptoms of foot and mouth disease, these will probably show you why this is such a devastating disease. So it causes fever and blisters on the tongue and lips, in and around the mouth, on mammary glands, and around the hooves, because again, foot and mouth, so that's pretty self-explanatory. So these blisters that are called vesicles can pop and turn into red areas that are called erosions. So obviously pain and discomfort can come from this, and that can lead to other symptoms such as depression, anorexia, so the animals won't want to eat, excessive salivation, lameness, because their feet are going to have blisters, so they may not be able to walk around very well, and reluctance to move or stand. So if you have an animal that's refusing to get up, then that's a good indicator that maybe something's wrong with its feet. Most affected animals will not die, but the disease leaves them so weakened and unable to produce meat and or milk the way that they did before. So the illness will actually appear within 2 to 14 days after infection. So it's pretty rapid once they are infected, and it can spread very rapidly, especially if you have animals that are all in the same area. And so this picture on the right just kind of shows you what this would look like in the mouth of a cow. So you can see those red blisters in the areas there. So other viral diseases, avian influenza, or kind of like bird flu, you may have heard it called, is caused by one of a series of viruses, and it's a disease that affects poultry, game, and wild birds. And so one big thing with avian influenza is that this disease can be spread, but an issue with this disease that you may not have with other diseases is that because it is carried by birds, migrating birds can spread the disease to different regions. And so that's something that is kind of a little bit different with this disease. You don't necessarily have to have, it's hard to kind of control it to one region if wild birds do have it, because they're going to migrate and they're going to carry it all over. So there's also influenza in people and domestic animals. So avian influenza viruses can mutate. Like I said, viruses can change their genetic makeup pretty rapidly. They can mutate into different subtypes or different forms. And so these forms can be actually pathogenic, which just means that they can cause disease to people and or domestic animals. So it can be transmitted directly from birds or through an intermediate host, such as a pig. So like I said, just because animals aren't necessarily showing symptoms doesn't mean that they're not carrying it. So a lot of these diseases can be spread fairly quickly throughout different species. So it's really important to be aware of. So swine flu, I guess I'm a little bit older than y'all, but I don't know if you remember in 2009 that there was the big swine flu deal. It was like all over the news. So that was a new influenza that was identified in people, and it was called the H1N1 because that was kind of the variation that was causing this influenza at the time. So it was originally referred to as swine flu because the genes in this virus were similar to the viruses that normally occur in pigs. So that's kind of where the swine flu name came from. So it was thought that the virus came from the reassortment of genomes from viruses that were typically occurring in pigs, birds, and people. So like I said, viruses can kind of change their genomes pretty rapidly, and so it was thought that all of these viruses that affect those different species, their genomes were kind of reassorted, and then you had this new H1N1 kind of subtype. And so that can actually happen when two viruses infect the same cell. There can be an exchange of genes. So that's just an example of how that could happen and how you get a new variation of a virus that you didn't have before, because somewhere in some animal, two viruses could have infected a cell at the same time and exchanged their genes. So that's kind of how that happens. So new diseases and things like that can pop up very rapidly through things like that. So other than viruses, you also have bacteria, which can cause disease. So there are a lot of different types of bacteria and different ways that they can cause disease. So bacteria are just a simple microscopic life form. So they would have to be seen under a microscope, is just what that means. Obviously, you can't just really look around and see bacteria, which thank God, because we don't want to see them everywhere. They're called prokaryotes because they do not contain a nucleus. And they do not have membrane-bound organelles. So if you think back to when we looked at that animal cell, they have a nucleus because that's where their DNA is. So bacteria don't have a nucleus. So their DNA is not bound in a nucleus. So a good way that I kind of keep this straight is that prokaryotes are no nucleus. No is my weird little trick for that. So animal cells would be eukaryotes. So it's good to remember that prokaryotes, no nucleus. I don't know if that helps you, but that's how I've always remembered it. So bacteria use DNA as their genetic material. And so diseases caused by bacteria, just to name a few, would be mastitis, which we talked about in dairy cattle, tripping fever, Lyme disease, which Trigger actually had this year somehow, even though he's an indoor dog. He came into contact with like one tick in his life. And then bubonic plague. Foodborne diseases also caused by bacteria, such as salmonella and listeria, are just some kind of off the top of my head. And then also E. coli would be a big one. So lots of different things caused by bacteria. So just to kind of show you a picture, just to kind of explain a little bit about the difference between bacteria. So again, I said like an animal cell, which would be the one that's kind of got the purple on the outside. I don't know if you can see my cursor. Eukaryotic cell, that's what they're called. So plant and animal cells are eukaryotes. And then this bacterial cell, which is at the top left, is a prokaryote. So pro, no nucleus. And so you can see that they have their circular DNA just kind of hanging out in the middle of the cell. It's not encased or housed in a nucleus. So that's a big difference between bacterial cells and animal and plant cells. Just to kind of show you that. So parasites can also cause disease. So parasite is an organism that just lives in close proximity to an animal and completely depends on that animal for life. So it will receive nutrition from the host and using the host's blood or absorbing nutrients inside the host's intestines. So like worms would be an example of something that could be in the intestines, getting nutrients there from the digestive tract. So they obviously adversely affect the quality of life for companion animals and livestock. They would reduce production efficiency. Pretty much any disease, anything that's pulling energy away from growth is going to do that. And they may result in the death of the animal, depending on where it's got. So internal parasites, you have protozoa, which are single-celled eukaryotes. So that means that they do have a nucleus and intracellular organelles. They can impact livestock and companion animals as parasites, and they can as zoonotic diseases. They could also have a symbiotic relationship. So symbiotic means that they're not necessarily harmful, that they're maybe helping the animal, and they're getting benefits from being in a relationship with the animal, being inside the host. So an example of that would be like microbes in the rumen. That's a symbiotic relationship where they're helping the animal and the animal is providing them with a host, so a place to live. So just a few protozoa would be trypanosome, coccidia. Coccidia is a big one that comes up in livestock. So if you've ever heard of coccidiosis, that's caused by that. And then Giardia intestinalis is another one. And so that's something that I know typically people worry about, like if they go camping a lot, if you drink any water from like a stream or a river or anything, Giardia can be a big problem there. So like I said, coccidiosis can be a pretty big problem in livestock. So it's caused by coccidia. So like I said, the disease name kind of comes from the organism that causes it. And so they're internal parasites that can actually infect the intestinal cells. So coccidiosis in poultry can have a significant impact. It can increase mortality, so the number of birds that die. That's supposed to say morbidity. There should be an R there. Morbidity, which is just sickness. So animals just not producing as well as they should or showing clinical symptoms. Reduced growth and poor feed conversion efficiency. So again, much like any other disease, if they're sick, they're not going to be growing very well and they're not going to have good feed efficiency. So coccidiostats are something that can be used that act upon these parasites. So it's an anti-protozoal because they're protozoa. It's an anti-protozoal agent that acts upon those parasites specifically. So it's always good that if you have animals that may come into contact with this or that have had coccidiosis in the past, that you are using coccidiostats to kind of combat this. Parasites, you have roundworms or nematodes. So intestinal roundworms are pretty much like what they say. They're just kind of long worms, like they're really gross. So if there are large numbers, like in a dog, that's going to give a puppy kind of a pot-bellied appearance and failure to thrive, because these roundworms are going to be in their digestive tract and they're going to be actually using the nutrients from what the animal is eating for themselves, and they're just going to be multiplying and growing. And so the animal itself is not going to be growing very well because it's not getting the nutrients that it needs. And it's a host to like all of these organisms. So it may cause diarrhea or vomiting, and in extreme circumstances, they can actually cause an intestinal blockage if there's enough. In horses, you'll have reduced growth and potential intestinal blockage. So it's definitely something to be aware of because once these things are in there, it can be a little bit of a process to get them out. So other worms, you have strongyles, I guess is how you say that. The bloodworms or red worms that live in the blood vessels of horses, that can be a big problem. So that can cause anemia because it's damaging the blood vessels, and it's going to cause a lot of bleeding, loss of weight due to damage to the intestine, and then colic or intestinal ulcers. So lots of different types of worms, and they can cause kind of different problems depending on which part of the body they're really infecting. And so this picture on this slide is just an example of an intestine that would be like completely filled with roundworms. So you can see how gross that is and imagine what that would look like in real life. So since parasites can be a problem, it's important to know how to prevent them. So internal parasites can be a problem in many animals, especially grazing livestock. because grazing livestock are going to be out on the pasture. They're going to kind of be like coming into contact with the ground and the soil. And so it might be a little bit more of a problem with animals that graze as opposed to like, you know, your dog that's getting food out of a bag. However, companion animals can still, they go out to a dog park or they go outside and they, you know, they can still get it, but it is more of a problem in grazing animals. So economic losses obviously can come from worm parasite infections, just like any other disease, and those losses can be significant depending on how big the problem is. So good management practices can reduce these losses, so like deworming and things like that. Younger animals are typically more susceptible to parasites, and that's just because younger animals don't quite have the immune system built up that older animals do. So older animals have been exposed to the parasites a lot longer, so they will build up a small degree of immunity. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't still be dewormed or anything like that. They're just not quite as susceptible as younger animals are because their immune system has seen that before. So they will have a little bit of immunity towards those organisms. So parasite prevention, I talked about deworming, especially for animals that graze a lot. So deworming also, some people just say worming or drenching. I know typically in sheep it's called drenching. So that's where an anthelmintic drug or dewormer is administered to a human or animal to rid them of helminths or parasitic worms, such as roundworm, flukes, and tapeworm. So the type of dewormer that you're using, the administration level, and the deworming schedule may all depend on the specific farm and management practices that you have in place. So not every farm may need the same type of dewormer, or they may not need to give it the same amount. If you have a problem where it seems to be like a really bad situation, you may want to deworm you know, more frequently than others. Of course, you need to be aware of what dewormers you're using because you don't want to give them too much. And be aware of body weight also of the animals and making sure that you're giving them the proper dose because you don't want to do too much. So just know that things like deworming and all of that does really depend on the situation and what organisms you're kind of coming into contact with. So if you do have a production system, just be aware of that and really tailor one to your management. So internal parasites, just to kind of continue on that. So you have roundworms or nematodes. We're just going to kind of keep talking about different worms, intestinal parasites, or internal parasites. So heartworms, if you have a dog and you've taken him to the vet, I'm sure you've been asked, is your dog on heartworm prevention? So heartworms can be found in the heart and blood vessels. They will reduce the host's ability to exercise, which will cause and could cause a loss of weight, and ultimately can cause death from congestive heart failure. And so you can see this picture on the right that obviously that animal, once it has gotten to that point, that animal is going to die. Like that heart is just so congested with worms that it's insane. And so there is prevention for it. You can get heartworm prevention for dogs and cats. Most of them are just like a simple little kind of tablet that looks like a treat that you give them like once a month. And so it's super expensive to treat if your animal does get heartworms. So everyone recommends, and I suggest too, heartworm prevention for dogs because we've had an outdoor dog who did get them before. And it is quite the process to treat. The dog is down for a while. They can't do much for a while because they can't exercise. So if you do have animals, especially animals that are going to be outside a lot, be aware of that. So it can be a really devastating disease. Pinworms are another type of worm that reside in the cecum and colon of horses. So just lots of different types of worms. Flatworms, which includes tapeworms, can live in the intestines of the primary host. So the head can actually embed itself in the upper small intestine using hooks and suckers. And I was going to put a picture of those, but they're extremely scary. So I did not even put that on there because they freak me out. So flies can cause fly strike, which we talked about particularly in sheep. So that's why you dock the tail in sheep, because flies will lay maggots in the wool, and then that's going to be a really bad situation. Bot flies are true flies that have a parasitic stage of their development. So they can lay eggs on the skin of a horse, and then they can be transferred to the mouth and intestines. And so eggs of bot flies are infectious to people. So something else to be aware of there. So as far as preventing external parasites, there are pour chemicals that can be used, and there are many different options. So for livestock, I actually saw this thing called the vet gun, where it actually shoots capsules that are filled with insecticide that burst when they hit the animal, and then that liquid will spread throughout the animal's skin and hair. So if you've ever put like a topical flea medicine on your dog, your cat, it kind of disperses through the hair. So this is kind of a similar setup. So that's an option because it eliminates the need to process through a chute and put it on that way. But again, it really just depends on your system and what you want to do. I imagine that the vet gun is probably more expensive than running your animals through a chute and pouring on some sort of prevention. So another thing you can do is have frequent pasture rotation, and that is to allow the manure in the pasture to dry, and that will decrease flies. So as you've probably seen if you've ever been on a farm, flies like to swarm around the manure, and if you have animals that are just staying in the same pasture, they're going to be constantly producing manure, right? And you're just going to have more and more flies. But if you move them to another pasture, then you kind of give that pasture a time to dry out, and then you're not going to have as many flies, and then eventually you can rotate them back in, if that makes sense. So that's something simple that you can do that doesn't really require all the chemicals and things like that, depending on how extensive you want to be. So ticks and mites are called ectoparasites because they live on the outside, so they're external parasites. So they live on the skin of animals, and they exist by sucking blood. And they can also kind of feed on dead skin. I know like particularly mites will do that. So there's the American dog tick, deer tick, Lone Star tick, mites, poultry mites. There's just so many types of these external parasites that you need to be aware of. And after dealing with Lyme's disease in my indoor dog, I highly recommend having your dog on some sort of flea and tick preventative because it is just so expensive. He was actually on something, and apparently it was a topical thing and it didn't work properly. So just something to be aware of that might save you over $1,000. So other insects, lice, can be blood-sucking or chewing on the skin. You have blood-sucking bugs and blood-sucking true flies. So mosquitoes and insects would kind of be examples of that. So mosquitoes are a big one. And so mosquitoes are actually a good example of how mosquitoes can kind of cause diseases with heartworm, actually. If mosquitoes, bite an infected animal and then they bite your animal, that's kind of how those are transmitted. So it's really, really good to have your animal on heartworm prevention because it's fairly easily transmitted that way because you can't control every mosquito that's going to touch your dog. So other non-infectious diseases that can happen, so diseases that are not caused by a pathogen or virus, could be diseases that have a nutritional, metabolic, or stress-related or genetic cause. So there are lots of different things that can cause diseases other than pathogens. So ascites is an example, and that's a metabolic disease that happens in poultry. So basically they get a lot of accumulation of fluid in their body cavity, so they can no longer supply their tissues with enough oxygen, and it will cause them to have an enlarged heart. And then obesity in companion animals, which we talked about in the companion animal lecture. But obesity can be considered a disease just because it's not caused by a virus or bacteria. It can be a big problem that can affect their health. So obesity actually predisposes the animal to further health problems. And so nutritional management is key. And so I always put on there, like, be careful with treats because I have to get on my parents a lot because my sister's dog at home was very, very overweight because they were just giving her treats all the time and not taking into account how many calories are actually in those treats, which you don't need to look at actual calorie number. But just know that if you are giving your dog a lot of treats or a lot of people's food, you don't need to be giving them the same amount of dog food that day. Because animals can get obese very quickly, especially companion animals that are in the house a lot. So another way to kind of combat obesity in companion animals is to look at labels on feed bags. So they'll usually have a guide to feeding. So usually they'll tell you the amount that you need to feed per weight of the animal. So it'll say, like, if your animal is 90 pounds, they need 5 cups or whatever. So it's a simple way that they've already figured that out for you based on the nutrients of that bag. Just look at the guide on the back, and that way you don't have to worry if you're overfeeding or underfeeding your animal. And so it's important also to know that you want to look at that for every bag because not all feeds have the same nutrient content. So some cheaper, like for example, cheaper dog foods may not be as rich in nutrients. So you may have to feed like 7 cups of a cheaper feed. Whereas if you got a more expensive feed that's a little bit more nutrient dense, you may only have to feed 4 or 5 cups. So that's why those recommendations are on there, because sometimes people will kind of switch up and they don't really consider that those feeds actually are different. So just something also to be aware of. I kind of go on a tangent about that because I am in nutrition, so sorry, I apologize. But so you may, like I said, be able to feed less of a high quality feed. So sometimes the cost may be, you know, it may be a little bit of a trade-off. You might pay a little bit more for a feed, but you don't have to feed as much, so that will last you a little bit longer. So just kind of something to think about. And obesity is typically something we pretty much just talk about with companion animals because livestock animals aren't really something that we're keeping around to the point or feeding them treats to the point where they're going to really have that big of an effect. Milk fever is another non-infectious disease that can happen in cattle, and that happens at the transition stage between late pregnancy and early lactation. So it's caused by hypocalcemia. So hypo, the way I remember it is low, so it means low calcium or reduced concentrations of calcium in the blood. So that's something that happens right at that transition period. So a common way to prevent this is the injection of calcium borogluconate just before or just after calving. So that will provide calcium to kind of help prevent this. So the calcium will provide a reservoir to increase the blood calcium at the time that it's needed for milk and colostrum. So there's a lot of calcium that's needed for milk, and like we've talked about colostrum before, they need a lot of calcium for that. And so that's what can kind of cause this low calcium situation in cattle because calcium's being taken you know, from their use to being put into milk production and things like that. So an injection of this calcium borogluconate can be really helpful. So the danger with that, though, is that it may not last long enough and milk fever may still occur before the calcium regulating mechanism of the cow is working efficiently. So some cows may need more than one injection of that calcium. So just something to think about if you have cows that are going to be at that stage in time, especially dairy cows because they are producing a lot of milk. So other diseases that are related to metabolism, aging, or mental health, you have cancer, osteoarthritis, heart disease, endocrine diseases. So the endocrine would be like hormone secretions. You can have hormone imbalances and things like that. Anxiety or confusion, and skin diseases, and then again obesity. A good one to talk about in companion animals and people. So does anybody have any questions on anything in that lecture or anything in general? Nope, everybody's good? Any questions about your assignment? Nope. Okay. All right, well with that, y'all have a good rest of your day and I will see you on Thursday.
All right,
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Good luck and bye. And remember to email Dixie if you come Friday.